talk about several things today. And first thing is going to be where we're kind of giving an update on where we're at with the ESA listing process. As you might know, that thing's working, I guess. This is sort of just I don't know if you can see that very well either, but it's just sort of a flow chart of what the usual progression of events are when you consider a species for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And usually what happens is you'll get a petition from somebody, and any United States citizen can submit a petition to us to list a species. They have to provide some evidence to go along with that, which is when we take this 90 days to review the evidence they provided and then decide whether to proceed from there or not. We were petitioned in 2008 to list Pacific walruses by the Center for Biological Diversity, which is an outfit out of Arizona, I believe, that kind of makes a living doing that kind of stuff. And in 2008 we found that there's substantial information to do a full-blown status review, which was the next step. If there wasn't, we would just kind of go over here and the process would sort of end, and they would probably come back later with more information and try again. So in 2008 we were petitioned. We got 90 days to respond to the petition and the information that's included in there. They decided at the time there's enough information to move forward with what we call a status review, which is in this box here. And we did that and completed that around 2010. And at that time we decided they were warranted for listing but precluded to hire priority species. So this put the walrus in the candidate species list, and at that time there were 250 some odd species that were on the list. Some of them had been there for many decades, 20, 30 years, and about that same time we were the same group, Center for Biological Diversity, and another group filed notice that they were going to sue us over the list of candidate species because no action was being taken on a lot of them. They were sitting on this list for decades and they weren't so happy about that. So basically the service settled out of court with those groups to develop a plan to deal with all these candidate species, and they set up we set up a time schedule with them. And since walrus was listed right before this happened, it's going to be the last one to be considered under this settlement. So that sort of brought us back up in this loop here again. So in 2016 we're back here reevaluating what was in the status review at that first time and updating that, trying to figure out what's changed and if we're going to change the listing or the decision here to either list or not. If we find that listing isn't warranted, then we'll just remove them from the candidate species list, and then that'll end the process. If we find it's warranted, then we go down this path and all the way through rule making and publication in the Federal Register and so on and so forth. Yeah, Rhonda, you got a question?
I was just making sure. Are we asking questions now, or are we waiting until the end?
Whenever you want. It's fine with me.
What type of evidence do you need to move them from that candidacy list? What type of criteria do you need to meet?
Well, in the this is going to get a little complicated. Right about the same time that this happened, or around 2015, actually, last year, the Fish and Wildlife Service decided to do a new process for evaluating listing decisions, which they call a species status assessment. And basically what it tries to do is separate the science end of things from the policy end of things. So in the first time when we did this in 2010, there was a process that's spelled out in the Endangered Species act that's called the 5-factor analysis, which basically lists 5 factors that you have to consider in listing, which is loss of habitat or destruction of habitat, overuse for commercial or recreational purposes, disease and predation. There's a couple more. One's just kind of an other category that catches everything, like oil and gas development or things like that. And then the other one was if there's adequate regulations to take care of all these other things or not. So those are the 5 things we had to review the first time. And the big the big finding back then was, the loss of sea ice was a major loss of habitat, which we sort of thought would lead to because the habitat was declining, we might end up with a decline in the population over time, and at some point it might get to the point where hunting was unsustainable. If the population kept declining and harvest levels didn't adjust as that population declined. So that's sort of what led us to the warranted but precluded finding at that time. So in that instance, so to answer your question, I guess when we turn the science over to the policymakers, they have to do that 5-factor analysis again, because that is actually in the Endangered Species Act, spelled out in the Act on how you're supposed to deal with that. So, but from our standpoint, from the science standpoint now, it's just purely a scientific document and endeavor where we'll try to look at basically what the guidance is to identify the needs of the species, so the life history traits, what they need for food, what they need for habitat, shelter, how to avoid predators and things like that. Try to assess the current condition of things are as far as meeting the species needs, and then try to look out into the future and see how that's going to change. So that's one of the things that led to the warranted but precluded finding last time, is that if you look way out into the future, like 100 years, some of these things go, they have ice projection models, that go out that far, and by the time you get out to the end of the century, things are looking pretty dire as far as the sea ice habitats go. So that's how we ended up there. Any more questions? So I don't know if you can see this too well, but this is sort of where we're at right now in here as far as the science process goes. One thing, we've put together a science team that's been meeting fairly regularly and trying to work through some modeling scenarios and a modeling exercise to try to project things out into the future. We're planning to develop and conduct a workshop to try to gather traditional ecological knowledge on walruses and the habitats. We're also developing a process for consultation with the tribes that are within the range of the walrus, as well as the corporations that are in the regions. And so our schedule is sort of to try to complete all this stuff by the end of this year, roughly. If we do, the rub here is that if we do decide that listing is warranted, which would be here with a warranted finding, then we have to start looking at developing critical habitat, which is another provision of the Endangered Species Act.
Who makes up the science team that meets?
Well, there's us on the Walrus program in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as we've got some people from our genetics lab that are participating in that, and then the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Lori Quakenbush is their marine mammal, Arctic marine mammal person for them, and then Chad Jay with the U.S. Geological Survey, he's their walrus research program leader.
Are you meeting with anyone internationally?
Yes, we were trying to set up some meetings with some Russian colleagues. It looks like World Wildlife Fund might have some money to do that we're trying to get that set up so we can meet with them. yeah, we'll have to see how that goes. Yeah.
Well, so I've paid attention to this since the Marine Mammal Protection Act happened, but during the 1860s and the whaling fleet days, the harvest of walrus really was over the top and brought things down. It took years for them to recover, and so I was curious how the the habitat, the carrying capacity and all that, how that would be determined, because prior to the exploitation during the whaling, they were widespread.
Yeah.
Pacific walrus went clear to Japan.
Right.
So I mean, it's all about what your starting point is where they stand.
Yeah. Yeah, and trying to get a carrying capacity is a pretty hard thing to try to figure out. We can basically use some proxies, more or less, like what's the extent of sea ice in their current range, and how is that changing from year to year, and the ice model projections into the future, and how that's going to look, and get some idea of what might be happening with the carrying capacity. And then there is some information on the food resources too. People have been collecting that information for a number of years, and that's continuing. It's pretty kind of coarse level, because sampling's pretty spread out and intermittent, but it does give you some sense of what's going on. And of course, with all the stuff with climate change and ocean acidification, there's a lot of research is just starting up, trying to look at what's happening with the benthic food items and how that's going to affect them. So there is some information out there that can kind of lead you to what you might think is going to happen there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess populations are cyclic, and it could be said that the population is, hit the top of its cycle and is just vacillating at this point. So
yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, and around late 70s, early 1980, they did think that it had reached a peak and probably exceeded the carrying capacity of the habitat, because they had some harvest restrictions in the 60s and early 70s, that allowed the population to grow. And it looks like since then, the population's sort of been declining, which you would expect, from that point onward, just because they had probably overshot the carrying capacity of the habitats, and people were seeing a lot of skinny animals, malnourished animals, not very many calves and things like that sort of led to those conclusions. So yeah.
So we're estimating the current population of the walrus. What methodology are you using? What's the current estimate?
Well, we will get to that a little bit later. And that's probably the last part of my presentation here on the project we're doing to try to get a better population estimate. So, so as I mentioned, we need to come up with a preliminary decision by the end of the year to be able to complete the critical habitat analysis and all the other things that have to go into this by October of 2017. So that's sort of the path we're working on with this right now, and where we're headed with this particular project. So if anybody has any more questions, I can move on about that. Yeah.
So I know when there's a listing for animals we put on the ESA, there's also a public comment process.
Right.
Now that they're on the considerate list, is that public process still open where individuals can make comments?
Yeah, there'll be a public comment period. Well, it depends on what we decide to do. If we decide to remove them from the candidate species list, we'll just publish a notice in the Federal Register that we're going to do that, and there won't be any public comment period. If we do decide that we need to list them, then there'll be a notice that we're going to develop a rule, and then we'll do a draft rule, and then there'll be a public comment period after that's been released, and then there'll be a final rule after the public comment period.